Everybody doing? Good, good. All right, so last night we had started watching a documentary on this 1918 Spanish flu influenza. We got about halfway through it. So tonight, what I want to do is just finish up that documentary so that we can begin after this looking at today's coronavirus and make a good historical comparison there, and then delve deeper into the social science issues regarding this throughout the other coming weeks. So I'm going to just start a couple minutes before we left off yesterday with our documentary.
With fluid, and so these people drowned. Only they didn't drown in the Atlantic Ocean; they drowned in their own fluids.
And I apologize, just real quickly. I just want to make sure this is set up appropriately here. So I'm going to go over here and video clip, and we're going to. And there we go.
The epidemic was now a national crisis. Something had to be done. In many places, officials rushed through laws requiring people to wear masks in public. All of America, it seemed, put on masks. At last, many thought, they were safe. But masks didn't help. They were thin and porous, no serious restraint to tiny microbes. It was like trying to keep out dust with chicken wire. In Washington, D.C., Commissioner Louis Brownlow banned all public gatherings. He closed the city's schools, theaters, and bars. He quarantined the sick. He did everything he had the power to do. But the death rate in Washington kept rising. A resolution shot through Congress, giving the Public Health Service $1 million to fight the flu. Biochemists around the country worked feverishly to develop a vaccine. Hundreds were produced. Then, a researcher in Massachusetts came up with the most promising solution. Hopes rose. Perhaps a cure was at hand. San Francisco's mayor wired for a huge shipment. A special envoy carried the vaccine across the country on the Fleet 20th Century Express. Soon, over 18,000 people in the city had been inoculated. But even vaccines didn't help.
They thought it was caused by a bacteria, so they made up a vaccine with the bacteria they thought was influenza. But you can't make a vaccine if you're looking at the wrong causative organism. They were on the wrong track. Influenza was caused by a virus.
Science knew next to nothing about viruses at this time. The optical microscopes they had couldn't show you virus. Virus is much too small for them. Nobody would ever see virus until the electron microscope came along, and that was decades after that. These poor scientists were looking for a needle in a haystack when they didn't know it was a needle they were looking for, and the needle was too small for them to see. So no wonder they didn't find it.
Medical science, at the very moment of its great rise to power, had failed to provide a cure.
At that moment, I decided never again to prate about the great achievements of science. The deadly influenza demonstrated the inferiority of human inventions. Victor Vaughan.
With science powerless, many people turned to folk remedies and quick fixes.
There was some quackery that existed at the time. There were all kinds of gimmicks that were being pursued by people in desperation.
I had camphor balls in a little sack around my neck. I know I couldn't stand myself, let alone somebody coming near me. I smelled so bad, I guess, in those days.
We used turpentine on sugar. We used kerosene on sugar, a few drops. You could smell this medication before you got too close to them. But it wasn't too bad because so many people had these different type medications until we were all smelling bad.
Everybody was asking for medicine and there wasn't any. So Dad came home and said, we've got to make medicine some way. And so in our kitchen, on our cook stove, Dad stewed up about 5 gallons. It wasn't real medicine, but it smelled like medicine and it tasted like medicine, and we put a lot of honey in it so that it would taste pretty good. And we passed it out to everyone who wanted medicine. It went in a hurry. There wasn't much left. It didn't do any harm. Most of them thought it did good.
In the middle of a crisis, you have to do something. And it's certainly an American characteristic that we have to do something even if it's wrong.
Folk remedies might have been wrong, but doctors were just as helpless.
They absolutely didn't know what to do for treatment of these patients. The ambulances would arrive in the morning. The drivers would bring in 4 living patients, but the nurses would go ahead and wrap these patients in the winding sheets, and they would put toe tags on the boys before they were even dead.
One doctor told a patient's wife, "This is my 25th case, and I've lost the first 24. A 12-year-old boy was told by his doctor, "Get on the waiting list for a casket."
My mother called the doctor because the whole family was sick with this flu. And I, being an infant baby, was very sick, to the point that the doctor thought that I would not make it. And he told my mother that it wasn't necessary to feed me anymore because I wasn't going to live.
In the month of September, some 12,000 people died of influenza in America. But those numbers would be dwarfed, for the full horror now began. October would be the cruelest month.
In the street, there were crepes at the door. If it was a young person, they put a white crepe at the door. If it was a middle-aged, they put a black, and if it was an elderly one, much older, they put a gray crepe at the door, signifying who died. So we were children, and we were excited to find out who died next.
My father, my older brother, and an uncle were all engaged in the funeral directing business. We lived in a funeral home. The influenza epidemic became so bad that the living room, the dining room were all occupied by row upon row of caskets. The fearsome part was it that these were friends of yours that were passing away. These were whole families that you knew. These were people you went to school with or went to church with. It was very eerie, very, very eerie.
The undertaker, which was a half a block away from me, had pine boxes on the sidewalk, piled high. Me and my 2 friends would go down there and play on the boxes. It was like climbing the pyramids, up and down and around and the whole bit, jumping off. And my mother told me that I should never go down there. Don't go on those boxes because there are people in them that have died. These 2 friends of mine got sick right after that. And so did I.
My father, being the health officer, was very concerned about the Indians who were our neighbors. They were only 6 miles away. So Dad and the city marshal rode up there one day to see how things were going at the Indian camps. And they were horrified at what they saw. After an Indian died, his family and friends would sit around chanting him to the happy hunting grounds, and they'd spend all night there. And by that time, they were all exposed. Everybody had the flu. Ultimately, they killed about half of the Indians.
No one was safe. In Washington, Victor Vaughn was working late, trying to make sense of the hellish chaos. He uncovered an unnerving fact. Usually, influenza kills only the weak, the very young and very old. But this time, it had a different target. People in the very prime of life, from 21 to 29, were the most vulnerable of all.
This infection, like war, kills the young, vigorous, robust adults. The husky male either made a speedy and rather abrupt recovery, or was likely to die.
The situation was upside down and backwards. A disease that's supposed to be a mild disease is killing people. The people it's killing are the strongest members, the most robust members of our society.
For example, soldiers. In Europe, the flu was devastating both sides. 70,000 American soldiers were sick. In some units, the flu killed 80% of the men. General John Pershing made a desperate plea for reinforcements. But that would mean sending soldiers across the Atlantic on troop ships.
There's nothing more crowded than a troop ship. It's just being jammed in there like sardines, and if somebody has a respiratory disease, everybody's going to get it.
President Woodrow Wilson now faced an agonizing decision. Sending the soldiers would be signing thousands of death warrants. Wilson gazed out his office window. After a long moment, he nodded. The troop shipments would have to continue. And then the president turned to his aide. I wonder if you have heard this limerick. I had a little bird, and his name was Enza.
Enza, help it, the way down, and influenza.
I lay like a stone at the farthest bottom of life. The smell of death was in my own body.
Catherine Ann Porter was finally admitted to the hospital, but she was now separated from her lieutenant. She was so sick that she was left on a stretcher in the hallway, left there to die. Porter's newspaper quietly set the type for her obituary. In New York, 851 people died of the flu in a single day. But the greatest horror came to Philadelphia. In 1 week in October, the death rate there was 700 times higher than normal.
In October, we were all sick. We had headaches, pains in the legs, the stomach, vomiting and everything. We were all sleeping close to one another because we only had 2 beds in the one room. Harry couldn't stay with us because he was too sick. I was like a second mother to Harry. Harry was always close to me. So when he was very sick, he kept calling me all the time, and I was always beside him. So my mother said, while Harry's sleeping, you go and lie down. My mother said he opened his eyes went back and forth, and his head went back and forth, and he said, Annie, my name was Nanina in Italian, Nanina, Nanina, and he died with my name in his mouth.
In Philadelphia, death carts roamed the city. It was a scene from the time of the Black Plague.
So many people died until they were instructed to ask for wooden boxes and to put the corpse, the people, on the front porches. An open truck came through the neighborhoods and picked up the bodies.
Still, the dead sometimes lay in the gutters, abandoned. Over at Potter's Field, they began to use a steam shovel to dig trenches for graves, mass graves. Over 11,000 people would die in Philadelphia alone that October. In Illinois, William Maxwell's mother had just given birth. He was still staying at his aunt's house.
My only knowledge of what was going on was the telephone, which I could hear because my room was near the head of the stairs. And I heard my aunt say, "Will, oh no." And then, "If you want me to." And she came into my room and she tried to tell us what had happened, and the tears ran down her face, and so she didn't need to tell me. I knew that the worst that could happen had happened. My mother was marvelous, and when she died, the shine went out of everything.
In 31 shocking days, the flu would kill over 195,000 Americans. It was the deadliest month in this nation's history. Coffins were in such demand that they were often stolen. Undertakers had to place armed guards around their prized boxes. The orderly life of America began to break down. All over the country, farms and factories shut down. Schools and churches closed. Homeless children wandered the streets. Their parents vanished. The vibrant and optimistic nation seemed to be falling apart.
People were actually afraid to talk to one another. It was almost like, don't breathe in my face. Don't look at me and breathe in my face, because you may give me the germ that I don't want. And you never knew from day to day who was going to be next on the death list.
Everybody was living in deadly fear because it was so quick, so sudden, and so terrifying. It destroyed the intimacy that existed amongst people in those days of the early 20th century.
An epidemic erodes social cohesiveness because the source of your danger is your fellow human beings. The source of your danger is your wife, children, parents, and so on. So if an epidemic goes on long enough and the bodies start to pile up and nobody can dig graves fast enough to put the people into them, then morality does start to break down.
Violence broke out. In San Francisco, a health department inspector shot a man who refused to wear a mask. In Chicago, a worker shouted, "I'll cure them my own way," and then cut the throats of his wife and 4 children.
People were surrounded by traumatic death, and they didn't have any idea how far it would go. Was it going to kill everybody? Could this be the end of the world? Is this Armageddon that the street corner ministers are preaching about?
In Washington, Victor Vaughan came to a frightening conclusion.
If the epidemic continues its mathematical rate of acceleration, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth.
But a miraculous thing began to happen. As mysteriously as it had come, the terror began to slip away. By early November, the flu had virtually disappeared from Boston. The toll in Washington fell below 50 a week. Even in ravaged Philadelphia, life was returning to normal. Then, on November 11th, the armistice ended the Great War. In San Francisco, the scene was surreal. 30,000 people paraded through the streets, all dancing, all singing, all wearing masks. The country had a lot to celebrate. Not only was the war over, but the worst of the epidemic was passing.
In light of our knowledge of influenza and the way it works, we do understand that it probably ran out of fuel. It ran out of people who were susceptible. It's like the firestorm. It sweeps through, and it has so many victims, and the survivors developed immunity.
But for some survivors, like Catherine Ann Porter, the return of health was not the end of pain. Her dashing lieutenant, who had faithfully tended her, was suddenly dead himself of influenza. The lieutenant's death, Porter later said, divided her life in 2.
It was one of the most terrible things that ever happened to me, that he should have died and I should have lived. He died, and it seems to me that I died then.
And then when we got out again and went back to school, I was shocked to see that my friends were not around. They weren't home. I would knock on their door and they would open the door just a little bit and says, "No, Jimmy's not here, or Frankie's not here." And where is he? Let your mother tell you. They wouldn't tell me. Let your mother tell you. I was a pretty lonely kid at the time because these were my friends that I played with all those years and went to school with. And when I lost them, my whole world changed.
The epidemic killed, at a very, very conservative estimate, 550,000 Americans in 10 months. That's more Americans than died in combat in all the wars of this century. And the epidemic killed at least 30 million in the world and infected the majority of the human species.
As soon as the dying stopped, the forgetting began.
It is in the individual memory of a great many of us, but it's not in our collective memory. That, for me, is the greatest mystery, how we could have forgotten anything so horrendous, so massively horrendous as this epidemic, which killed so many of us, killed us so fast, and our reaction was to forget it.
Why? You know, why wasn't that part of our memory or of our history? And I think it's probably because it was so awful while it was happening, so frightening, that people just got rid of the memory. But it always lingers there as a kind of an uneasiness. If it happened once before, what's to say it's not going to happen again? The more we find out about influenza virus, the more real that fear becomes.
The fall of 1918 was a time of horror, a time to forget. But some would always remember.
I remember my mother putting a white sheet, a white piece of cloth over his face, and they closed the casket. I can't forget. It was very, very bad.
The effect of my mother's death was that I realized for the first time and forever that we were not safe. We were not beyond harm. My father did what he could. He kept us together as a family, but from that time on there was a sadness which had not existed before. There was a deep down sadness that never quite went away because I knew people aren't safe. Nobody is safe. Terrible things can happen to anybody.
American Experience Influenza 1918 is available on DVD. To order, visit shop.pbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Well, still. So, what do you think about the similarities between that history of the 1918 flu and what you see going on right now?
Well, I thought it was funny in coffins and like all the panic that ensued and stuff, because a lot more people died than I guess I thought they did.
Black blizzards.
Hold still. It's starting another presentation on me, so I'm going to have to minimize this for a second. Pause that. Okay. What do you think about the masks? You know, we have such a big worry about people are now at home all over Facebook. I'm seeing, making masks for them. How viable do you think these homemade masks are? This is what kind of worries me. When I see what's going on in 1918 and everybody wearing a mask, but these masks, like I said, very porous, not really keeping out small microbes. How effective are these masks that people are making and pushing out into, the medical public?
They're not at all.
It makes you wonder why they're doing it. I mean, is it just the psychological, like they said in the video, people are doing, they got to feel like they can do something. Is this just us pretending to do something and it really has no effect?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the same thing with like the fashionable like masks that people are wearing all the time now. Like those have no purpose.
People just like an answer, even if there isn't one.
Yeah. They're trying to compensate not knowing with doing something that they think is going to prevent it. But nobody knows what's going to
do you think this doing something is good, or could it be harmful in the end?
I don't want to say it's harmful, but I don't know.
Well, I'm not talking about just the masks either. You know, there's lots of, you know, we're out there, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. Is just this feeling that we have to do something harmful in the end, or is it really helping us psychologically, or, you know, even helping, you know, scientifically eradicate the disease?
It's starting mass panic because there was no panic at all until like 3 weeks ago. And then all of a sudden, like one day, there was mass panic and nobody knew what was happening, but everyone was just following like the swarms of people doing it. Nobody was like keeping up with what was happening. They just were following the crowd. And
that's
kind of how it
the
is.
toilet paper shortage, for example.
Yeah.
All right, well, I hope you got something out of this. Tomorrow, I'm going to start talking about the timeline of the coronavirus here in the United States so that we have kind of a historical comparison with the Spanish flu. And there have been a couple things put out there that I'm still trying to find full episodes of about that so that we have some kind of, you know, video comparison then of the timelines there that then we can start pursuing. And next week, start maybe getting into what exactly is the role of government in this, and what is their role, and how far can they take this role as far as controlling this pandemic. And we'll do a comparison of what the United States and various states did in 1918 versus what's going on today, and really an analysis in the end, how helpful are these things comparatively? What can we expect as far as when all this is over with the coronavirus? Did it help, or was it unnecessary? Was it just us panicking and trying to do something like we discussed with the masks? So did you guys have any other questions tonight? Okay, well, I'll see you guys tomorrow night. None of the other classes are meeting tomorrow, but to make up for Monday, I'm going to meet tomorrow with this and have that discussion, okay? So I hope I'll see you then. I hope everything's okay with you guys. You got everything you need, toilet paper, masks, whatever, and I'll see you guys.
My mom's freaking out over the masks, so we have them.
All right, well, I'll talk to you guys later.